says, as an academic, that the old understanding of the cosmos, the geocentric cosmos, with the Earth at the center, surrounded by the seven heavens, each heaven with its own planet and each planet with its own influences that it would shed upon the Earth. Lewis presented it in ways which can be interpreted as lacking design, lacking coherence. It's not irrational to take that conclusion. But if you know the inner meaning of his design, if you understand that he's actually working to express the symbolism of the seven heavens, then even these oddities and peculiarities begin to make sense. And once you've accepted that moral law, or halfway to believing in Christ, who is the only one who keeps the moral law and who enables us sinners to get right with the moral law that we have offended.
C.S. Lewis, one of the greatest apologists of 20th century, author of Chronicles of Narnia, and also great mind, poet, philosopher, and so on. But who is actually C.S. Lewis? What of the essence of his genius, I would say. So my name is Mikhail Bakumov, and this is Reason Plus Faith podcast. And today we have Michael Ward, who is an English literary critic and theologian, and he is one of the most prominent C.S. Lewis scholar, and he works at the University of Oxford, where he is an associate member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion, and he is an author of the several books, including Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis, and also After Humanity, A Guide to C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man, which actually I read recently in this absolutely amazing book that hopefully we will discuss today. And so Michael Ward is great scholar, and I really looking forward to these discussions. Dr. Ward, hello, how are you doing?
Hello, Mikhail. I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for having me. It's good for us Michaels to stick together.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I have watched some of your interviews. In almost in every interview, some people mention that you actually one of the actor in James Bond. So I also would like to include this note in this discussion, and hopefully we can see picture later in this podcast.
Okay.
Okay, so let's start with some basic questions about you. Tell us about yourself a little bit. How did you become a Christian, and why did you decide to become a scholar?
I was born into a Christian family. My parents were very faithful, devout, evangelical Anglicans. They're members of the Church of England here in England. And I was born into a family of three boys, and I was baptized as a baby and brought up going to church, and was confirmed as an Anglican in my teens. And that's really how it all started for me. How I became a scholar. Well, when I was very little, my parents read to me and my brothers the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, which I enjoyed. And they told me that there was a second level of meaning to these books, that they weren't just fairy tales, but Aslan, the lion of this story, was a bit like Jesus. And the white witch villain character, she was a bit like the devil. And I was intrigued by this because I wasn't used to stories having more than one level of meaning. And as soon as I was old enough to read them for myself, I did so. And then I went through Lewis's other fiction and his works on Christian apologetics. And then I came to Oxford to study English for my first degree, and I did a short undergraduate thesis on Lewis. And that was really the inciting incident, actually, that kick-started my whole career as a Lewis specialist. I wasn't really planning or, in any calculated way expecting or hoping to be a scholar of C.S. Lewis, but because of that one short undergraduate thesis I wrote, I was asked after I graduated to give a one-off lecture on Lewis for the Oxford Department for Continuing Education. And then I was asked to give a short course of tuition, just 2 weeks, for an undergraduate who wanted to study Lewis. And little by little, I was asked to do more and more speaking and writing on Lewis. And eventually I ended up living in his old house, the Kilns, just outside Oxford, where he lived for half his life, where he died. I lived there myself for 3 years, looking after the house and showing people around it. And I got to sleep in his old bedroom and study in his old study. It was a great 3 years. And so when the time came for me to do my own doctorate, C.S. Lewis was the obvious choice because I was already fairly expert in his writings. Um, and that's how it all gradually snowballed into a entire career. Not through any great deliberation or forethought, but just because I liked him and I found that I was quite good at understanding him. And so here I am now. It's been a wonderful ride.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it is really excited to live in his home and to see all of this stuff that's related with C.S. Lewis. It's also one of my dream to be one time in these places and to see myself. Uh, and you also, as a professor at Houston Christian University, as far as I know, you teach course on apologetics and C.S. Lewis. Yes, is it right?
That's right. At Houston Christian University, we have a Master of Arts program in Christian apologetics. It's 100% online, and I teach two 8-week courses for that program, one on Lewis and nobody else. And then the other course I teach partly on Lewis, partly on Tolkien, and a little bit on G.K. Chesterton and George MacDonald.
Wow, that's great. Actually, I also one of the new students in this program, so hopefully sometimes in the future I will hear from you also. So this is really great. And let's start with your book, Planet Narnia. So you already described to us how would you start this project? How did you start this project? And C.S. Lewis obviously wrote this Chronicles of Narnia, one of the most popular books in this field of fiction. And could you tell us a little bit about the thesis of your book? So you wrote your dissertation, and after this you wrote book, actually two books about this book, and you claim that you find some key or you solve actually a mystery of Chronicles of Narnia. So it's really interesting, and I suppose most people in Ukraine don't know anything about it, so it would be interesting.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mentioned that when I was a boy, my parents told me that there was a second level of meaning to Narnia, that it wasn't just a fairy story, but it was also a Christian allegory of some kind with a sort of biblical parallel going on behind the story. Um, and that's true, but it's a bit perplexing as to why that biblical parallel is not more consistent throughout, because there are 7 books in the Narnia series, and 3 of them are very clearly linked to biblical events. So, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first story, you have a kind of reimagining in Narnian terms of the gospel story. In The Magician's Nephew, you have a reimagining of the creation story from the book of Genesis. And in The Last Battle, the final chronicle of Narnia, you have a reimagining of the book of Revelation and the Last Judgment. But in the other 4 books, even though Aslan, the lion, the Christ-like lion, is present and central, there's no major element or episode of Christ's life or ministry, no particular obvious biblical parallel that Lewis is reimagining. And that has confused people and troubled them. And they have said, why is it inconsistent? Why is it not more thoroughgoing? And some people have said, well, Lewis just wrote these books in a rush and they were for children anyway, so he didn't put much effort into them. We shouldn't expect them to be very careful. They've been described as a mishmash and a hodgepodge. But other people have said, well, that's not very like C.S. Lewis. He was a very rigorous, consistent thinker, didn't do things in a slapdash or haphazard way. And so those people have said there must be some additional level of design going on as well as the obvious biblical parallels. And all sorts of different theories have been suggested, like the seven deadly sins or the seven sacraments or really any seven that people can think of. But it fell to me to come up with the idea that it was the seven heavens, the seven planets of medieval cosmology, which actually give the series its coherence and overarching design. And although that might sound a bit sort of esoteric and far-fetched, we must remember that C.S. Lewis was a was a medievalist. He taught medieval literature at Oxford for his career. He wrote fiction and Christian apologetics just as a sideline, but his professional career was in medieval and Renaissance literary history. And he says, as an academic, that the old understanding of the cosmos, the geocentric cosmos, with the Earth at the center, surrounded by the seven heavens, each heaven with its own planet and each planet with its own influences that it would shed upon the Earth. He said of that system, that sevenfold planetary system, was, in his view, a set of spiritual symbols that were permanently valuable, indeed especially worthwhile in his own generation. Those seven spiritual symbols were for him really good ways of talking about the Christian life. And as I looked into this more carefully, I realized that, yes, three of these seven spiritual symbols align very clearly and naturally with the gospel, with the creation, and with the last judgment. And four of them align much less clearly with any particular biblical episode. But Lewis is nonetheless using them in a very Christian and biblically uh, consistent, compatible fashion. And once you approach the Narnia books from this planetary symbolism, they make much better sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, for most people, it's even surprising because we all, or most people know only these C.S. Lewis apologetics books. That's why it's so strange for us. And recently, I even tried to read his this book that he called "Oh Hell," yeah, this history of English literature, and it's so hard to read for me as a Ukrainian and as a person who knows little bit about apologetics, but who knows almost nothing about English literature. But you can see that actually Lewis was expert in this area that we even can't even anticipate sometimes. And but tell us a little bit about this medieval cosmology. Did Lewis truly believe in this cosmology, or was it simply a literary tool for him? I know that some people say that he could imagine that, for example, every planet has some angels or some angelic beings that's related to this planet, something like this.
Yes, he studied the system very closely as a medieval literary historian and indeed as a classicist, because he had studied classics first at Oxford. And so he was interested in the classical mythological background to the gods and the goddesses of the planets as they were imagined in classical and medieval times. Um, but and he writes about it very extensively in his academic works. You mentioned his book on English literature in the 16th century. That book opens with a long discussion of the new astronomy that came in the 16th century when Copernicus theorized that we live not in a geocentric system, an Earth-centered system, but in a heliocentric system with the sun at the center, and we go around the sun. The sun does not go around us. And Lewis was interested in that just from the point of view of a literary historian, because he wanted to see how this revolution in astronomy played out in the literature of the period. And then in one of his other academic books called The Discarded Image, he has a long chapter called simply The Heavens, in which he expounds how the heavens were understood in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So he's got a very learned, detailed expertise in how this old cosmological system was understood. And he valued it. He thought it was beautiful and colorful and symbolically powerful. But he also recognized that scientifically, nobody still believes that we live in a geocentric system. You know, Copernicus overthrew that idea, and Galileo and other astronomers confirmed it in the 17th century when the telescope was invented. So we know it's not true literally, but it's still valuable symbolically, Lewis said, because it has behind it centuries and centuries of human imaginative, literary, artistic thinking, which it's valuable to plug into. And that's why Lewis says it's these seven planets are spiritual symbols of permanent value. Okay, we no longer believe that the earth is surrounded by these seven heavens, but so what? We can just use that old system for its poetic qualities. And we can, especially if we're Christians, as he was, as I am, we can use that symbolism to talk about Christ and the Christian life. So, let me just very quickly list the seven heavens, so that we know what we're talking about. And of course, the best way to think about them is in connection with the 7 days of the week, because the names of the days of the week come from the planets, or at least they do in English. So, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Saturn, the sun, and the moon. Those are the planets behind those 3 days. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you have to think in Norse mythology there. Tu for Tuesday is like Mars in Roman mythology. And Woden for Wednesday is like the Roman Mercury, and so on. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday are Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus. And if you know French or Spanish, if you think martes, miércoles, jueves, and viernes, or in French, mardi, mercredi, jeudi, vendredi, it's a bit clearer in those languages how the planets connect to those 4 days of the week. So we should remember that the sun and the moon are regarded as planets in this old scheme, and that there's nobody knows yet about Uranus or Neptune, or let alone Pluto, so that those you can ignore. But each of these seven planets over time accumulated all sorts of attributes and characteristics and qualities, which Lewis loved from an imaginative point of view, and he wanted to not only just understand them from a historical perspective, but keep them alive in the modern imagination so that his readers and his students could understand medieval literature more effectively. Because, great medieval writers like Dante, like Chaucer, and later writers like Spencer and Milton, they're using this old system themselves all the time. And you can't read their literature. You can't understand the painting and even some of the architecture of the Middle Ages if you don't have this scheme in the back of your mind. So not just in his academic writings, but also in his poetry and in his fiction, Lewis uses this symbolism repeatedly. But in Narnia, he uses it secretly, or I should say implicitly. He doesn't tell us what he's doing. He just, as it were, throws us into these seven spiritual symbols as they construct and permeate each of the seven stories, so that we feel their qualities from within. At any rate, that's what I discovered in the course of my PhD researches, and that's what my book, Planet Narnia, is all about.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I suppose it was more clearer for his friends and colleagues who also study this medieval cosmology, although only you discover this secret, and that's really interesting too. And let's see how this planetary influence help explain some of the more puzzling or obscure moments in the Chronicles of Narnia. For example, could this influence explain these stories or events when we have appearance of the Father Christmas, or Susan's rejection of Narnia, or children's death in the books, and so on? This is like classical problematic places in the Chronicles of Narnia, and I was interested. What do you think about this?
Yes. So you put your finger on a prime example of what people have pointed to as an apparent example of slipshod writing, or hodgepodge, mishmash, slapdash writing, that Lewis includes the character of Father Christmas in the first story, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And people have said he doesn't belong in the story because the story is set in this fictional kingdom of Narnia. But in Narnia, nobody knows of a character called Christ. They know of a character called Aslan, who we can see is obviously Christ-like, but he's never called Christ. So what would the Narnians understand by Father Christmas? That doesn't seem to make sense. If they don't have a Christ character and yet they're somehow aware of the feast of Christmas, what's going on? Doesn't seem to make sense. Um, and that's a good objection. And in fact, it was made to C.S. Lewis even before the book was published. One of his friends read the draft of the story and said, you should leave out Father Christmas. But Lewis was insistent that Father Christmas did belong, but didn't explain why. I think the explanation is that Lewis was writing that first story in order to communicate the atmosphere and the qualities and the influences of Jupiter. Jupiter was the best of the planets. He was the king of the planets. He was the most fortunate of the planets. And he was always associated with kingship, with festivity, with magnanimity, with jollity, and in the modern sense of the word, joviality. Jove, of course, is another name for Jupiter. And when Lewis was lecturing on the planets at Oxford, as he frequently did, when talking about Jupiter, he would say those born under Jupiter are apt to be loud-voiced and red-faced and jolly. And he would then pause and add, it is obvious under which planet I was born. Because he himself was red-faced and loud-voiced and jolly. And lots of his friends described him as jovial without necessarily realizing how significant that term was for him. So if you think about Father Christmas, loud-voiced, red-faced, jolly, the bringer of jollity, the giver of gifts, he, as it were, crystallizes, he personifies almost in the modern imagination many of these jovial characteristics, which are otherwise largely absent from the modern imagination. Lewis said that too much of the modern imagination was dominated by Jupiter's opposite, by Saturn. Saturn being associated with not jollity, but gravity and death and disaster. And too much of the modern imagination, Lewis said, was saturnine as a result of, most obviously, the First World War, the Great War of 1914 to 18, which Lewis himself had fought in, and thousands, millions of people worldwide had been killed in it. And so Lewis says about much of the culture of the 1920s and 30s that it had become Saturnocentric, centered upon, rather fixated upon, saturnine qualities of death and cynicism and pessimism. And that's one of the reasons why he thought that Jupiter needed to be rehabilitated as a spiritual symbol to counteract these saturnine influences. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why he decided to write that book first, because Jupiter was for him particularly valuable. I mean, all seven symbols were valuable, but Jupiter was the most timely, the most needful for the modern imagination. And Father Christmas helps to sum up an aspect of the jovial personality. That's why he's included. He might not belong in strict logic, but it's poetic and symbolic and artistic logic that Lewis, atmospheric logic that Lewis, I think, um, is working to express. Now, you also mentioned the death of Susan and the death of, oh, sorry, the absence of Susan from the last battle and the death of all the other characters. Um, and that too is explicable once we understand that that final story, the last battle, it is indeed written to express the qualities of Saturn, who, as I say, was associated with all sorts of negative and dark qualities, including doubt and despair. Rather like Susan, she begins to doubt that Narnia exists. She's no longer a friend of Narnia, we're told. So she's left out of that last story. And all the other characters who are in the story die. Um, because Saturn is another name for Saturn is Father Time, or we might say the Grim Reaper with his scythe, with his sickle, cutting people down and bringing about death and disaster. And that's why Narnia is actually brought to a close in that final book by Father Time. His name was once Saturn, Lewis says in one of his academic books. And indeed, this is getting a bit complicated, a little bit detailed, but I discovered that in an early draft of the Narnia books, a typescript, before he had published Narnia, he actually called this character not Father Time, but the god Saturn. It's there in the draft of the story, which is a nice little piece of evidence. I hope, I trust that this theory is correct.
Yeah, that's amazing, and this like theory could explain so well so many details. Yeah, and I know, for example, that Alister McGrath, who is also C.S. Lewis scholar, he often said that we should just forgive Lewis these like mistakes in his Chronicles of Narnia. But I suppose it's like too easy solution to C.S. Lewis because he was so genius in his writing. So it's not like mistake, but it seems like something in there's some plan in this.
Yes, and before we go on, actually, can I give my reasoning as to why Lewis would be willing to present a story which looks like it contains mistakes? Because yeah, I mean they do appear to be glitches or blotches or errors. They seem to be inconsistent, and Lewis knew that. You know, Lewis was a very skillful writer and a very brilliant man. He wasn't unaware of how people would look at these elements. So, but he was prepared to write a story which looked like it contained inconsistencies and mistakes. Now, why would he do that? I think it's because we should remember that Lewis hadn't always been a Christian. For many years, from about the age of 12, roughly, until he was in his early 30s, Lewis went through a long period, nearly 2 decades, of calling himself an atheist. He didn't believe in Christianity. He didn't believe in God at all. And he looked out on the universe and saw and thought, how can anyone believe that this universe, which is so full of cruelty and chaos and meaningless accidents and innocent suffering, how can anybody believe that there is a good and loving and powerful God behind this universe? And that was his attitude as a non-believer. But then, of course, he became a Christian and he began to interpret the data from an entirely different point of view. That in the universe had not changed, but his attitude, his perspective on the universe had changed completely. It had undergone a complete 180-degree revolution. Um, and so he came to view the cosmos not as a bleak and meaningless empty space, but now he regarded the night sky as the heavens that tell the glory of God, in the words of Psalm 19. Psalm 19 was Lewis's favorite psalm. He said it was the greatest poem in the book of Psalms and one of the greatest lyrics in the world. The heavens are telling the glory of God. But previously, he'd looked up at empty space and thought, no, the blackness and the coldness and the vacuity of space is evidence that God doesn't exist. So, what I'm trying to say is that when he wrote Narnia, when he sort of, as it were, created his own imagined universe, Lewis presented it in ways which can be interpreted as lacking design, lacking coherence. It's not irrational to take that conclusion. But if you know the inner meaning of his design, if you understand that he's actually working to express the symbolism of the seven heavens, then even these oddities and peculiarities begin to make sense. Everything springs into focus once you have the right pair of spectacles to look through. Um, and that, I think, is what underlies this whole strategy from an imaginative point of view. He's wanting to, as it were, express in fiction the reality that he himself went through as he moved from atheism to Christianity. You can dismiss Narnia as a hodgepodge, but you shouldn't dismiss it prematurely. You should think harder. You should look deeper. And when you do, you begin to see, no, the designer of this fictional world also has his own purposes, which he's working out, even though they are mysterious.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could, to every piece of literature, yeah, we could be sympathetic to author and we could be like more hostile to author. And from this, we could deduce some different conclusions, I guess. But I remember that also in one of his book, Walter Hooper also said that before his death, C.S. Lewis would like to like improve some of his Narnian books and to work with some of the mistakes that he did. Do you know what C.S. Lewis talked about? What is the mistakes he is talking about in this passage?
No, I don't actually. I can't bring to mind a passage where Walter Hooper says that. I'm not saying you're wrong, but that isn't something that rings bells with me. I mean, I'm not. By the way, I'm not saying that the Narnia books are absolutely unimprovable. That there aren't genuine mistakes, real mistakes, as well as the apparent mistakes. No doubt they could be tweaked and refined a little bit further, but I'm not aware myself of particular real mistakes that Lewis knew about and wanted to correct. Um, if you come across that passage, please send it to me because
Yeah,
that's not
absolutely.
something that's not something that I have factored in. Um,
Yeah,
no.
yeah. I could be wrong too, so I don't know if I remember correctly, but it just surprised me because I don't know any like real factual or brute errors in Chronicles of Narnia. So it just interested to me what is the mistakes that we're talking about. Um, yeah, but let's move to like another questions about Lewis. Well, how unorthodox were Lewis' views? Some scholars claim, for example, that he was a universalist, or that he once, in one of his letters, I suppose, he wrote about praying to God Apollo, or that he's incorporated some occult imagery into his works. And we have also other claims from different people. So what is your assessment of his views?
Yes, I don't think myself that Lewis can easily be categorized as unorthodox, at least not from the things that he positively asserts about Christianity. Um, so, for instance, the claim that he was a universalist is totally without foundation. There's no grounds for that. Lewis has a long chapter on hell in his book, The Problem of Pain, in which he defends the doctrine of hell and says, no, there is such a thing as damnation. He says that, I'd quite like it not to be there. I don't want people to go to hell, but it's such an inextricable element of the biblical narrative that you can't avoid it. You have to accept it. Um, Now, I think I know the reason why some people mistakenly assume that Lewis was a universalist, and that's because in the last battle, the final Narnia Chronicle, there is a character called Emeth who hasn't been worshipping Aslan, hasn't known about Aslan, and yet after death he finds himself in the Narnian equivalent of heaven. And so people look at that character and say, oh, so Lewis must have been a universalist because he seems to be depicting the possible salvation of a pagan. But that overlooks another very significant element in the story, which is the Narnian equivalent of the Last Judgment, when all the characters run up to Aslan, and some look at him with horror and dismay and disappear into his dark shadow, and some look at him with love and delight, and then they pass into the heavenly Narnia. So obviously, those who disappear into his dark shadow are going to the Narnian equivalent of hell. Not everybody is saved in Narnia at all. So there's no sense in which it's a universalist depiction of salvation. Emeth, this one particular character, is an example of what theologians would call not a universalism, but an inclusivism when it comes to salvation. That God can include in salvation even some people who didn't know that they were worshipping him in this life. They didn't know it because they'd never heard the gospel. But according to their lights, according to natural theology, according to the light that God had given them, they were loving God with their heart and soul and mind and strength, even though they didn't know God under the correct title. Um, so that's what Lewis is trying to depict with the character of Emeth. But we needn't get into any further details about that. All I'm saying is that it's quite wrong to say Lewis was a universalist. You can say he was an inclusivist, yes, but that's a different thing. Um, as for the questions of praying to Apollo, well, yes, Lewis, in a letter, a private letter, said that when he was in Greece on his honeymoon, that when he was there with his dying wife, he just married his wife, but she was dying, and they knew she was dying, and so it was much on his mind that if only he could find some way that she could be healed, he would reach for it. And they were there in Greece in the temple of Apollo, or in some place associated with Apollo the healer in Greek mythology. And so Lewis said to his correspondent, one almost felt tempted to pray to Apollo the healer. One felt that it wouldn't have been terribly wrong to do so in that place, and that it wouldn't have been so disastrously wrong because, after all, God, Apollo is really just an attempt in the human imagination to reach for God, who desires the health and salvation of all people. Um, that's what he's getting at. He's not saying that he did pray to Apollo or that he recommended praying to Apollo. He's just saying in this particular context, for this particular reason, he felt it wouldn't have been terribly wrong. And for someone with Lewis's, deep classical learning, you can see why he said that. But he wasn't seriously recommending praying to pagan gods at all. No, he was a very orthodox man. I mean, of course, the question then arises, how do we determine orthodoxy? Um, Lewis was a Protestant, he was an Anglican, but even as an Anglican Protestant, he did believe in purgatory. And some fellow Protestants would say, well, that's deeply unorthodox. But of course, Catholics and Orthodox Eastern Orthodox Christians would say, well, it's not at all unorthodox. It's entirely orthodox. So, we come up against the definition of orthodoxy when we come to an issue like purgatory, which Lewis did believe in, and did write about in one or two public places. But that's really the only obvious place where I think Protestants would have grounds for saying he was unorthodox.
Yeah. I think so. And even there is some Protestants who also believe in purgatory. So
Well, exactly, yes, and increasingly so. So one of my colleagues at Houston Christian University, who's a Protestant, Jerry Walls, has written extensively about how purgatory is something that the Bible teaches and that all Christians should believe in, but from a Protestant perspective.
yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned his wife, Joy Davidman. Just a quick question: do you agree with this assessment from Alister McGrath about their relationship, that it was started from not pure motifs, something like this? Because I know it's like debatable questions among scholars.
Well, I think there is some evidence that she, Joy, was quite determined to marry him. That she went to Oxford from America with the intention of getting him to be her husband somehow or other. Um, and from her point of view, given that she was already married to another man, that was improper, to put it mildly. But she did get divorced, um, and it was then that she fell ill with cancer, and she was expected to die imminently. And that's when they got married Christianly, Lewis and Joy. And so it was a very extraordinary situation that Lewis thought that he was marrying a dying woman who would be dead within weeks. So it was hardly like an ordinary normal marriage in any case. Um, so there are lots of sort of complications and extenuating circumstances surrounding that relationship. Um, but I don't think that Lewis himself was approaching it in any sort of improper fashion. I mean, he admitted, he couldn't deny that she was a divorcee. And in those days, the Church of England did not allow the marriage of divorcees in church. But Lewis argued, well, Joy's first husband had himself been previously married to another woman. So if only first marriages are legitimate, then Joy was never married to her first husband because he was still married to his first wife. So that's another reason in which it was a very complicated situation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, again, After Humanity, your great book that I read recently. And this book is the explanation or guide to the abolition of man, one of the most maybe sophisticated books from C.S. Lewis that we actually have translation in Russian, but it's so poetic that it's not actually give us clear understanding of this book. So it's unfortunately that we should read also in English to understand what this Lewis actually said in this book. And so I think most of people didn't understand this, at least in our context, this book, because it's so different from our context. And could you explain why did Lewis decide to write this book, and why did you decide to write this book about this book?
Yes, good questions. So the abolition of man originated as three lectures that Lewis gave during the Second World War. He was invited to give these lectures. He had to choose a subject, and he selected this particular subject of whether value is objective or subjective. And Lewis thought that was a really important philosophical question to get right. And that getting that question sorted out was really important as a way of preparing the ground for a presentation of the Christian gospel. Now, Lewis himself, before he became a Christian, before he became an adult Christian in his 30s, during those years when he was an unbeliever, he still was philosophically wrestling with this question of right and whether right and wrong are objective realities. And And he came to believe that they were, even while he refused to believe in God. So, from a purely philosophical standpoint, Lewis said, no, right and wrong are objective realities. I didn't make up this moral ecology in which I find myself. It's there, whether I like it or not, and often I don't like it. But I find my conscience alert to these moral realities, which I didn't invent, which I just have to recognize as being out there in the universe. Who knows whether there's a God behind this moral reality? It took him a long time to get to a belief in God, and then in particular the Christian God. But just philosophically, he got to the idea of objective value. And so he saw from his own personal experience how useful it was as a stepping stone. Once you've accepted the reality of moral law, well, then you're halfway to belief in a moral law giver. And once you've accepted a moral law, you're halfway to believing in Christ, who is the only one who keeps the moral law and who enables us sinners to get right with the moral law that we have offended and broken. So those are some of the sort of personal autobiographical reasons why Lewis thought that this question was one that he wanted to address in The Abolition of Man. And another, of course, is just looking around him. He saw that subjectivism, the idea that morality is not objective, but that we just make it up. We just project our ideas of value onto the universe from whatever we happen to want to be true at any given moment. Lewis saw that subjectivism was gaining ground in the early decades of the 20th century. He saw all sorts of Oxford colleagues propounding subjectivism, and he thought this is a menace. This is something that needs to be tackled academically, philosophically. So that's why he wrote The Abolition of Man. And I wrote my guide to The Abolition of Man because the book is very difficult. It's short. It's a slim little book, but it's very, very, very dense and hard going and rather sort of oblique. Lewis takes an unusual angle on his subject. And there are lots of allusions and quotations in foreign languages, Greek and Latin and French and all sorts of complex ideas that are sort of not unpacked in any very helpful fashion. I mean, because Lewis was delivering these lectures at a high academic level. And so he didn't need to make things sort of accessible and comprehensible like he usually does with his more popular books. So I, in my own teaching on C.S. Lewis, have noticed how many students really struggle to understand what he's getting at. And I thought, if I write a guide, I can probably help these students. And indeed, I can help myself because I'm no philosopher myself. I learned a huge amount as I wrote this guide, teaching myself so that I could help teach others.
Yeah, absolutely. And even from the first chapter, this title, first chapter, "Man Without Chest," it's actually so strange phrase that in our Russian translation, this phrase was completely translated in another way, because I guess translators just can't understand what does it mean. So that's interesting. Yeah, and we have so many these details that you explain in this book. So it's really a good guide for all who would like to explore more, and also this different details about his personal life. Like for example, he had a debate, I guess, with A.J. Ayer, yeah, in Socratic Club. So I didn't know this, but it's really fascinating because A.J. Ayer is one of the most brilliant philosophers of 20th century. So you could imagine how Lewis was good in his philosophical education too, to have this debate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and well, we unfortunately don't have time to go more, but I guess one last question about moral argument. Could you explain what was Lewis' position on the moral argument? Because in mere Christianity, he doesn't insist that morality necessarily proves that there is a personal God. And in the Abolition of Man, he states that he is not making an argument for Christianity or even for theism, I guess, yeah? So how did Lewis actually view the moral argument?
Yes, in the Abolition of Man, Lewis's argument is simply philosophical. He's saying whether this position about belief in objective value, whether that implies a supernatural origin for objective value or not, that's a question I'm not going to get into. He just doesn't advance the argument into theological territory. He just keeps it avowedly philosophical. Now, of course, in mere Christianity, he takes the next step from the law to the lawgiver, God, to the law fulfiller and the law transcender, Jesus Christ. And so, people should read Mere Christianity if they want to see how Lewis does take those further steps, linking his belief in objective value to God and to Christ. And Lewis does think that the moral argument is one of the best arguments for God and eventually for Christ. And people should read or reread this book to see how he takes those steps, because, well, that's a long and detailed question. I don't want to get into trying to summarize Lewis's own argument, but he sees the value of the moral argument for God and for Christianity, and that's why he, in his main book of Christian apologetics, his main introductory volume, that's precisely where he starts with the moral argument. He thinks that's one of the best ways into defending Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have very interesting edition of Mere Christianity. It's interesting cover.
Yes,
I never said this before. See this before.
yes,
Yeah.
it's the version of the book I grew up reading, and I've always liked this front cover.
Yeah. Well, very interesting. Yeah. Could you recommend maybe few books that you really like that is about C.S. Lewis that would be good for our listeners?
Thank you. Yes, well, of course, we've already talked about two of them, my books, Planet Narnia and After Humanity. But aside from those, perhaps the best single volume book on C.S. Lewis is by Walter Hooper. In fact, I've got it behind me. Let me just. There it is. C.S. Lewis, A Companion and Guide by Walter Hooper.
Oh,
It's thick, it's very
yeah.
detailed, but it's really, really helpful. It's got a short biography of him. It's got summaries of all his major works. It's got a section on his key ideas, a section all about the people in Lewis's life, the places in Lewis's life. Um, that's easily the best book to lay your hands on if you want to get into C.S. Lewis. And apart from that, I also edited a book called The Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, and that's slightly more connected to Lewis's ideas than to his life. It's a volume with, I think, 21 chapters looking at different books and different themes in Lewis's output. The Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis and Walter Hooper's Companion and Guide. Those are the two books I would encourage people to look at.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ward. It's really a privilege to speak with you and to learn from you. Thank you for your work, and hopefully we could see each other in the future.
I hope so. Yes, that would be great. Thank you for having me, Mikhail.